Welcome back. This time we're talking about Timeless, Season 1, Episode 13, Karma Chameleon. Now, I have to say up front, this episode surprised the heck out of me. One, it's the first episode to really break from the show's formula. Our heroes are not going back in time to stop Flynn. In fact, one of our heroes stays in the present. Instead, they're going back to try to save Wyatt's wife by ensuring that the parents of the man who killed her never, get together. And two, honestly, I was not expecting a lot of forward storyline progression because we were going to be all focused on Wyatt's story. And instead, we had some major developments on several fronts on our long-term storylines. And the result was an episode that felt refreshingly different and very satisfying in that we got a lot of new information and story development for these season-long arcs. Now, as I alluded to, the primary storyline for this episode is pretty simple. Wyatt wants to steal the lifeboat and go back in time to save his wife. Rufus had already agreed at the end of last episode to help him. And while Lucy agrees to go with him as well, he tells her not to because he needs her to stay behind and basically rat on him to ensure that she doesn't get in trouble because he knows that this act is going to basically ruin his chances of continuing with the team. Until Jaya's ready to pilot herself, Rufus cannot be replaced. And as Wyatt tells her in a very strong opening scene, he doesn't want Lucy risking the chance of saving her own sister because he knows if she helps him, her deal with Agent Christopher will be out the window. And so Wyatt and Rufus by themselves go back to March 13th, 1983, which Rufus mentions is quite close to his birthday. Once again reminding me that I'm now old enough to be older than most of the television characters I watch. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say that this is the best episode for Matt Lanter, who plays Wyatt. He is phenomenal in this episode, especially in the final scene, which is just absolutely just heartbreaking. But before we get to that scene, first we have to go back to the early 1980s. And Rufus did provide some great comic relief in an otherwise pretty depressing episode as he was geeking out over all of the 80s television shows and video games. Of course, I had a bad feeling about this episode from the beginning. First of all, the title Karma Chameleon just sounds ominous when you're dealing with time travel and potentially changing the past. Additionally, I just didn't think that they were going to wrap up one of the three main characters' primary storylines so quickly. For Wyatt, it's him trying to save his wife. For Lucy, it's trying to save her sister as well as investigating her connections to Rittenhouse, which I'll get into later in this video. And for Rufus, it's about protecting his family and getting out from underneath the thumb of Rittenhouse. And I don't think any of those are going to get wrapped up very quickly. So while I would have been very happy if Wyatt had gotten his happy ending, I just didn't think it was going to happen. And despite going through many trials and tribulations trying to keep these two people, Wes Gilliam's parents, from hooking up in a hotel room, and he's ultimately actually successful, although he accidentally kills the man. It turns out that Wes Gilliam, although he had killed two other women, the two women that he was in prison for, he was not the murderer of Wyatt's wife. And if Wyatt is ever given the chance to go on another mission, I'm guessing his next encounter with Flynn is going to be somewhat heated. I don't really think I need to go into all of the details of all the things that they had to try to overcome to stop them from having sex. If you're watching this video, I'm assuming you've seen the episode. But I do want to say that the show did a good job of getting us to think that he may have actually saved his wife. Because there's the whole conversation he has with Rufus on the way back, talking about how his wife would not have liked that. So we think, well, maybe the bad ending will be something sort of like what Flynn had been talking about in one of the earlier episodes, how even if he saves his family, he's done so many horrible things at this point that he really can't be around them now. Instead, of course, it turns out that he didn't save his wife. And him just pleading with them at the end as he's being hauled away to tell him that his wife is alive was just, that was the emotional, low point, but as far as acting goes, high point of this entire season so far. That was brutal to watch and just wonderfully acted, wonderfully presented, and just kind of just puts everything in a very down note. especially since this episode's B story ends in a similar fashion. And that B story involves Emma Whitmore, Anthony's old partner who Flynn rescued from the Old West in the previous episode. At the time, she had talked about how she had learned more about Rittenhouse's plans for the time machine, things that even Anthony didn't know. And I have to admit, I was really annoyed at the beginning of this episode when we pick up with Emma, Flynn, and Anthony having a conversation, with Emma having just finished telling them what she knew. And I was really worried that the show was going to play coy with that information for a long time. It turns out they weren't. We get to learn more about it later, at least in broad terms, without much in the way of specifics. But at the time, I really was annoyed. But whatever their plans are, it's so bad that Emma wants them to destroy the mothership to ensure that Rittenhouse never gets their hands on it. And Flynn, for a second there, actually considers it, even though his family would not be saved. But after that second, his more dogmatic personality returns and he declares that that's not going to happen. They're going to continue on with the mission at hand, namely wiping out Rittenhouse from history so they don't have to worry about him at all in the first place. But it's clear from that scene that Anthony is wavering. He's never been a fan of the tactics that Flynn has been using, but what he does know about Rittenhouse, even before this latest revelation, have gotten him on board that the ends justify the means. But learning that things could be even worse if Rittenhouse had full access to the time machine, he ends up contacting Rufus. But of course, Rufus is back in time with Wyatt trying to save his wife. So he ends up having to talk to Lucy. And he tries to make a deal with her. He'll destroy the mothership if she and Rufus agree to destroy the lifeboat. And it's during this scene that we get the information that we didn't get earlier in the episode. And that is that Rittenhouse plans to use the time machine. That's why they had bankrolled Connor Mason's experiments, so they could go back in time. Because what we find out is that while Rittenhouse seems to be all-powerful and all-knowing, they're actually dwindling. They're losing the long-term battle against those that are against them. And that is sort of a revelation in itself, that there are other people out there in the present that are fighting against Rittenhouse, and that there were people in the past doing the same. He names drops JFK and Martin Luther King Jr. as those that got in Rittenhouse's way, so they got rid of them. But again, they're losing the long battle, so they want to go back in time and wipe out anyone that could oppose them, ensuring that they have this, as Anthony describes it, a clean, sterile world for them to occupy and rule. Lucy seems to be on board with this, and that's honestly not surprising knowing her desire to protect the past. What did surprise me, however, was that she actually went to Agent Christopher and told her everything. And even more surprising, Agent Christopher agreed to go along with it. And it was gratifying to see that she's the one that noted about that they needed to save Lucy's sister first. We later see Anthony with some C4 as he's attempting to sabotage the mothership. And it was in that scene, and I probably should have realized it earlier, but it was in that scene in particular when Emma, Flynn, and Anthony are all there together that I realized that with the introduction of Emma, Anthony is now what Rufus is not: expendable. And unfortunately for Anthony, that proves to be the case, because they do see an explosion in Oakland that Anthony had warned them about, but when they show up, there's no sign that the mothership was destroyed, and instead they find Anthony shot to death. What we don't get to see is Emma's reaction to the fact that Anthony was killed, because they were good friends during the whole time they were working with Connor on developing the time machine. Now, in our final scene, we go back to Lucy. This is after Wyatt has had his horrible revelation in that his wife is still dead, and Lucy follows up on something that she learned during her conversation with Agent Christopher when they're talking about how they can't trust Connor Mason, and she shows her some pictures of Connor Mason talking to some Rittenhouse agent, and it turns out it's her father. So this finally gives her the courage to go confront the man. She shows up, and not only does he not deny it, he gladly accepts his place in Rittenhouse and tells her that it's in her blood as well. It's her legacy to be part of Rittenhouse. Ending the episode with him saying, "We have so much to talk about." So there we go. Again, a lot of new information in this episode, some big developments when it comes to Wyatt. We don't know when or how he will ever be able to be back on the team and who's going to replace him in the interim. We have Lucy confronting her past and, as her father puts it, her future. And we lost one of our long-term characters in Anthony. So real quick, before we wrap up, let me do a rundown of my usual questions. Number 1, Flynn's mission. Again, we had a big seismic change as far as his personnel. Anthony is dead. Emma is apparently his new pilot. She has given him new information about what Rittenhouse wants to use the time machine for. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we don't know exactly how Emma is going to feel about Anthony being killed. We honestly don't even know who shot Anthony. Those are things that we're going to have to find out, presumably sooner rather than later. As far as Rittenhouse goes, again, there's that revelation of what exactly they wanted to use the time machine for. It was always obvious that an outfit like Rittenhouse did not want a time machine made just so they could go witness cool times in history. There was always going to be nefarious purposes. But the idea that they're actually losing ground in present day is probably the biggest deal, the biggest revelation of anything that we'd gotten in this episode. Up until this point, their armor has seemed bulletproof. Even when Flynn is able to kill their founder back in 1780, nothing really changes. So the idea that they're actually losing the war is very interesting and shows that this battle is not just about stopping Flynn from destroying them, but also getting the time machine back so they can save themselves from these other outside forces. And the fact that we know nothing about any of these outside forces up until this point provides some intriguing story potential as we move further into the season. Question 3, as far as Lucy's notebook goes, didn't come up because really this was not a Stop Flynn mission. Although I'm curious to know if the notebook mentioned anything about Flynn killing Anthony. Because as Flynn has been telling us this whole time, Lucy eventually joins him, so she would know that Anthony was no longer around. Which in turn begs the question, did Flynn know all along that he was going to eventually have to take out Anthony? And is that how he knew that Anthony was attempting to sabotage the mothership? Moving on, I'm going to add a question because it's now definitely a separate subject, and that is Wyatt's past, namely who killed his wife. We thought we knew. Wyatt thought he knew. It's now obvious that Flynn lied to him, but did give him a killer to kill. It could be as simple as Flynn needed someone that Wyatt would believe had killed his wife. And it did seem like that guy knew more about Wyatt and his wife than he should have. So there's more to that story, even though he wasn't the one that actually killed his wife. And finally, moving on to question what is now 5, is Lucy's past. I pretty much covered this already, but Lucy finally confronts her father. And not only does he not deny being in Rittenhouse, he's proud of it, telling her that he's on the good side, that she just doesn't know any better, and that they have a lot to talk about, and that this is her legacy, that it's in blood. This is building on that idea that we first got in the Watergate tape, when we were told that Rittenhouse is sort of a blood legacy, that it's passed down from generation to generation. We also saw a little bit of this in the Benedict Arnold episode. So by virtue of her father being in Rittenhouse, Lucy is capable and eligible to be a member of Rittenhouse. Which in turn begs a question, how much do they know about the people who killed their founder? Do they know that Lucy, Wyatt, and Rufus were involved, but that were there? I mean, they were using their real names at the time. That would be a little awkward, during the whole induction ceremony where, we had this founder, but he was murdered, and, I was kind of part of that. So I don't know how it's going to play out, but it'll be interesting to see, once again, how that develops moving forward. To kind of tie all this together, again, this was an episode that really broke from the usual formula. I liked it. It was different. Not that I don't like the usual formula, but you got to break away at least once or twice. But also just gave a lot more development than I ever really expected from what could have easily been more of a bottle episode. So what did you think of this episode? What do you think is going to happen to Wyatt? How long do you think he's going to be off the team? What did you think about the other developments, the loss of Anthony, as well as the revelation that Rittenhouse may not be the end-all, be-all bad guy that we think, that they actually have other adversaries, and those other adversaries may be slowly winning. As always, you can subscribe to my channel, check out some of my other reviews, and until next time, be considerate when ordering banana daiquiris.